Great. Hi, Todd. This is John Sheirer, and the story is called Chain of Events. And here is an excerpt from it that's, in summary, it's a story about a teenager who tries to use his family chainsaw for the first time without his father's supervision. So this is when he's actually trying to start the chainsaw. Brian braced his foot atop the saw, pinning it to the ground, and yanked. As he'd feared, the pull cord caught and recoiled as the rubber handle slipped from his grip on the first pull. His fist shot upward and barely missed his own face, instead slamming against his earmuffs, sending his hard hat flying off his head. He retrieved the hat, shook the pain from his hand, and glanced around to see if anyone was looking. Specifically, he scanned the house windows to see if his mother was watching. He didn't see her, and he had no way of knowing that she was watching from a darkened second-floor bathroom, standing far enough from the window to be invisible to her young son, trying to do the hardest thing a parent can manage, stand back and allow her child to grow up. Brian gripped the handle tighter, drew in a deep breath, and pulled again. This time, he held on, and the motor spun but didn't catch. He pulled again, then 6 more times. Nothing happened. Brian noticed his breathing was getting faster as the first trickles of sweat dropped from his forehead and streaked his goggles. He checked the levers and switches and noticed that the saw's on-off switch was in the off position. He swore quietly to himself, a word he had heard from his father now and then during yard work sessions that weren't going as planned. He was especially glad that Brian wasn't here to witness his boneheaded omission. Brian flicked the switch to the on and yanked it again. With this pull, the chainsaw thundered and burst to life. Well, it's about, like I said, it's about a teenage boy. For many years, he's been, like when his father goes away on business, kind of a family joke is that he and his twin brother are the men of the house. And of course it was a joke as they were growing up because the mother was in charge of the house when the father would go away on business. But he's actually becoming an adult. He's 17 years old now, and he is really aware of how much he wants to show that he's an adult, or at least his version of an adult. So the main conflict is between his reality and his self-perception. He and his brother have always helped the father with yard work, including using the chainsaw, and he wants to try it for himself to prove that he can do it as sort of this transition into manhood. So I try to provide enough context that readers wonder how Ryan's father and his mother and his brother are going to react to what he's doing. The father and brother are physically away during this time, but the mother's actually there observing him from a distance without him even knowing that she's watching. So her perception is always there in the back of the reader's mind as the events unfold, and that adds more layers of conflict to the situation. But there's a lot of tension because he's fairly confident and kind of realistic about his skills and about the risk, but he's also sort of ritualistic in the sense that he believes he'll be okay if he does what his father taught him, and in a sense he's imitating his father. And things do go relatively well up to a point, as he makes his way through these various close calls while he's cutting down a dead tree in the family's backyard. That's a really good question. I think like a lot of writers, I discovered everything I know about writing through reading, experiencing literature as a reader and as a viewer of movies and television shows, and then trying to bring that into my own writing. My young adult reading and TV and movie viewing experiences were always focused on immersing myself into the characters, most of the time even more than the action. So for me, tension comes from those early experiences, appreciating character development and working to bring that quality to my own writing. I love a well-developed character like, Olive Kittredge in Elizabeth Strout's books, Walter White in Breaking Bad. Whether those characters are in mundane situations or completely crazy situations, there's always tension because we can't help but care about what they do and about what happens to them next. And I try to create these well-rounded characters like that, who are somehow consistent and accessible to readers. They don't have to be likable necessarily, or even someone whose motivation a reader can fully grasp. But the key thing for the tension is that readers just have to care about what happens to them next. Yeah, I think I'll just summarize it in a short answer. Create well-rounded characters in situations that make readers care about them. And I think that's sort of an essential definition of fiction overall. Good fiction has well-rounded characters who we care about, and that's where the tension comes from. That's a really excellent question, and I think for me, it's sort of an unexpected answer. There's a short story by Kate Chopin, who's famous for writing The Awakening, and it's called The Story of an Hour, and it's barely 1,000 words long, and it was written in 1894. It's a story of a young wife who learns that her husband has died in a train accident. And the tension and the character development begin right in the first line when we learn some really essential details about the main character in a situation. And that first line is, knowing that Mrs. Mallard was afflicted with a heart condition, great care was taken to break to her as gently as possible the news of her husband's death. So her husband's friend and her sister are telling her that they've learned that her husband has died in a train accident. And the most important element for character development, that first line, is that we learn she suffered a huge loss. It's something that we really can sympathize with, empathize with, we can relate to, because we all understand how enormous that kind of a loss is in someone's life. So right away, the tension starts building. We start caring just because of the character and the situation. But there's something even more significant and subtly put in there, the idea that she has heart trouble, she has a heart condition, so they have to be gentle and careful in telling her this. And that, of course, foreshadows something really eventful that we build to that happens at the end. And there's even more sort of indirect, subtle foreshadowing, because, and it's kind of the idea of a narrator who's not quite reliable, because they say, the narrator states that great care was taken to break to her as gently as possible this terrible news. But we find out at the end of the story that it was not great care taken. It was really careless the way this news was delivered to her. And that adds to the character development of the minor characters, sort of in an unspoken way. And all of that interplay between the characters creates the tension. The narrative is interesting because there's not a lot of actual events that happen. There's not a lot of action. The whole story is her reflecting on what it means to her, this transition in her life, that she's now a young widow. But despite the lack of action, the lack of events, the tension is created by how that character changes and develops going through these different levels of grief that she experiences, and how we understand her in context with the minor characters in the story as well. That's really interesting because sometimes tension and suspense are considered synonymous. But I think there's a little bit of a difference, and it connects with what I've been saying about character development. I think tension is character-generated conflict, the way we care about what's going to happen to a character. And suspense is more dependent on events. It's event-generated conflict. If readers care about what happens to a character, then they'll experience tension. But if the conflict comes primarily from the events that might be gripping and compelling and unexpected, then that creates suspense. Sometimes even seemingly random events, like in an action movie or a spy thriller, where we don't quite know what's going on, we still experience the suspense of knowing these events are going to lead to something. But if you combine characters that readers really care about with events that also grip us in a compelling way, that's a great way of creating conflict. And then we have both tension and suspense, which I think ultimately can lead to the best kind of storytelling. Oh, sure. I have a new book coming out this summer. It's a collection of short stories called Stumbling Through Adulthood, and Chain of Events is one of the stories in there. I guess I'm giving a shout out to myself that I would love people to look for that. And like I said, it should be available by midsummer or so. It's called Stumbling Through Adulthood, a collection of short stories.